Okay, I think we're live. So today I just wanted to conclude this tripartite tripartite series of surahs which deals with Islamic eschatology. And this surah is entitled the Sure Calamity. Hi GW. Which also in the original form it would be Al-Haqqa, and it derives its title from the first three verses where that is repeated in each verse. So in verse one, it says, "The sure calamity!" Exclamation point. What is the sure calamity? Exclamation point. No question mark. So that's I'm assuming that's an imperative. And what would make you realize what the sure calamity is? Again, no question mark, just an exclamation point. Oh, hi Gorns. Glad you dropped by. So Al Haka, that's repeated three times, and he's going to go on to explain what the sure calamity is. In verse 4, it says, Samud and Ad called the striking calamity a lie. Now, he's referring to two civilizations. Samud, which was an Arabian civilization located in Hijaz, around where Muhammad was trying to proselytize, and Ad, which is another ancient civilization that was supposedly destroyed in a storm. And Muhammad used this as a talking point to try to indoctrinate people into believing that anyone who rejected his message was destined to be smitten by God. And he used Ad as an example. The fact that this Arabian civilization was supposedly effaced in a great storm. Oh, hi, Love and Light. Was supposedly effaced in this great storm and it disappeared. The Samud lived up until briefly before Muhammad's time. So these are civilizations that his audience would have been familiar with, and he used that as a as a talking point in order to preach Islam and say, if you reject Islam, you're going to be destroyed, just like these two civilizations were destroyed. Ad in a storm, and the Samud basically disappearing. So he continues, then as to Samud, they were destroyed by an excessively severe punishment, and as to Ad, they were destroyed by a roaring, violent blast, which he made to prevail against them for 7 nights and 8 days unremittingly, so that you might have seen the people therein prostrate as if they were the trunks of hollow palms. And I made a little notation here, legend. So this is his speculation or speculation that he derived from folklore, that this is why the Ad were destroyed. Today, climate change alarmists would probably say, "Well, just look at this, look at this civilization that was destroyed. These were obviously people who weren't listening to the." I don't know if there were any proto-environmentalists or global warming groups around in 5th century Arabia, but they would have pointed to that and said, "Look, this you were punished by Mother Nature or Gaia for not heeding its will." But Muhammad used it as an opportunity to proclaim Islam and say this is proof that these people who rejected Islam were destroyed, despite the fact that Islam did not exist at the time that these civilizations were wiped out. But he tried to connect two separate things. In this case, he tried to say that these people were warned by Hud or Hud, which legend has it is a reference to Eber. Now, Eber was the great grandson of Noah, and in the lineage of Abraham. So this was another example of Muhammad trying to retcon Islam back in time and to fit it into this pre-existing biblical narrative, the story of Abraham, the story of Abraham, or before him of Noah, trying to take these figures from the Bible, the patriarchs or the prophets from the Bible, and insert Islam into this lineage in order to make it seem like Islam was this monotheistic faith that's derived from the past. And this is why you have all of these famous patriarchs and prophets and apostles from the Bible being described as Muslim, even though Islam did not exist for centuries and centuries after their deaths. So you have Jesus being described as a Muslim, you have Mary, his mother, being described as a Muslim, you have all the way going back to Abraham and his sons, Isaac and his son Jacob. They're all described as Muslim and worshiping Allah. And Muslims will try to say, well, no, they're not saying they're Muslims in the sense of the the Islam that came about after Muhammad. They're saying they're worshiping the same God that Muhammad worshipped. But the problem is, Muhammad meant this literally. He believed that there was an Islam that existed from the time of Adam. Even though the Quran also says that Muhammad was the first to submit to Allah, it implies that Islam has existed from the dawn of man. So from Adam all the way up to Muhammad, it existed. It was simply forgotten and neglected. And that's why you have things like Muhammad referring to the sacred mosque in Mecca before Muhammad controlled Mecca and before Islam was institutionalized. So the sacred mosque had a bunch of idols. It was filled with idols. It was on a trading route, and this was a source of revenue for the pagan Arabs that lived there. But they were not Muslims. They explicitly rejected Islam when Muhammad was trying to preach to them. But he still referred to it as a sacred mosque before his army entered into Mecca. So he was referring to a pagan site of worship as the sacred mosque. So you have to ask yourself, why would he do that? Because Islam was a religion that was derived from these pre-existing pagan practices. It's not that these people had forgotten Islam. It's that Islam did not exist. It's something that Muhammad invented and that he grafted onto these pre-existing concepts. And a pre-existing God, Allah, was already in existence. It's just that he took it and manipulated it and made people believe that this was a revelation. So he did the same thing here. He used a figure, or at least in Islamic tradition, someone that was supposedly a figure in the Bible, the grandson of Noah. He used that to try to link Islam to the past, to try to link it to set it in this biblical narrative, which is simply an anachronism. So he continues. Do you then see one of them remaining, referring to Ad? And Pharaoh and those before him and the overthrown cities continuously committed sins, and they disobeyed the apostle of their Lord. So he punished them with a severe punishment. He's referring to Moses in this case. Surely we bore you up in the ship when the water rose high, so that we may make a reminder to you, and that the retaining ear might retain it. And this you also find in the Quran too, continually shifting, not just narratives, but going back and forth many years in time and conflating. Just like he had a figure from the book of Esther, Haman, who worked for the ruler of the king of Persia. He transplanted him into ancient Egypt and had him working for Pharaoh, and then kind of grafted historical um, uh, anecdotes onto that person because he didn't understand he didn't understand the chronology of the Bible or the chronology of the nation of Israel. So he just kind of combined and time shifted all of these different biblical narratives. And you see that throughout the Quran, he'll go back and forth. Like, for example, in this one verse, he goes from talking about Ad in Arabic and using Arabic folklore, and then he shifts to Pharaoh and presumably Moses, and then right afterwards he goes to Noah and the flood. So just three completely separate events occurring at three different times, and he just combines all of them sequentially. And in verse 12 it says, so that we may make it a reminder to you, and that the retaining ear might retain it. And when the trumpet is blown with a single blast, and the earth and the mountains are borne away and crushed with a single crushing, on that day shall the great event come to pass. Now, again, he's using biblical language, the idea of the trump sounding, and this ushering in the day of the Lord, and using it for his own purposes to try to proselytize and advance his own ideas and his own newly created religion. And in verse 16 continues, and the heaven shall cleave asunder, so that on that day it shall be frail, and the angels shall be on the sides thereof, and above them 8 shall bear on that day your Lord's power. So he's discussing angels and the active role they have in this. If you read the book of Revelation, the active role taken by angels. So in verse 18 it says, and on that day you shall be exposed to view, no secret of yours shall remain hidden. Then as for him who is given his book in his right hand, he will say, lo, read my book. Surely I knew that I shall meet my account. So he shall be in a life of pleasure, in a lofty garden, the fruits of which are near at hand. Eat and drink pleasantly for what you did beforehand in the days gone by. And as for him who was given his book in his left hand, he shall say, oh, would that my book had never been given to me, and I had not known what my account was. Oh, would that it had made an end of me. And this again is has echoes of what you read in Revelation, particularly the final judgment. So in Revelation 20, chapter 20, verse 11, the great you have an exposition of the great white throne of judgment and the judgment of people who are unsaved. And it says, and I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged out of the things which were written in the books, according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and the dead in hell delivered up the dead which were in them. And they were judged every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And there is a problem with the way Muhammad approaches the judgment, particularly when you see the people being judged based on their works are people who are going to be sent into the lake of fire. It's not people who that's the great white throne, not the judgment seat of Christ, where people are their works are tried, but they're not but they're not going to be judged based upon their works. Whereas in Islam, you have this works-based soteriology where everything is basically an accounting of your works. And like I said in an earlier video, it's very similar to what you find in ancient Egypt, where you would have Osiris judging someone's life and whether or not they're condemned based on um, putting their heart on one end of the scale and a feather on the other, and if their heart weighs more, then they're condemned. This was very, very similar to what you find in Islam, even though it's repeatedly emphasized how you have to believe in Allah. That's really subsidiary to doing works and obeying obeying Muhammad. And it's a never ending cycle where you just keep repeating over and over, and you're never really sure of your salvation, and you don't have any real eternal security. But but as you can see from this, there are echoes of biblical language when it comes to the day of judgment, but it's also very distorted and skewed. It's from Muhammad's perspective and how he views judgment, and he doesn't have a real understanding of the Bible. He wasn't really exposed to sound doctrine, so even when he has certain elements that you see in the New Testament or the Old Testament, it's completely awry the way it's the way it's described. So in 29, he says, "My authority has gone away from me. Lay hold on him, then put a chain on him, then cast him into the burning fire, then thrust into a chain the length of which is 70 cubits." And it's kind of funny when you look at this that he specifies the number of cubits that the chain thrusting someone into the fire is going to be, but he doesn't specify how he doesn't specify the he doesn't give the specifications of the ark. So something that's actually delineated in scripture that you find in the Old Testament, the size of the ark, he doesn't give, but something that's completely invented and has no real has no real basis in Revelation, he puts it there. So when it comes to measurements that are actually contained in the Bible, he doesn't give them because he's not cognizant of what those are. He hasn't sat down and actually read and been exposed to the Bible in a systematic way. So that he can't do. So when he actually has to recapitulate the story of Noah or the story of Abraham, he can't do it in a consistent fashion. He's basically just taking bits and pieces and snippets of things that he's heard or been exposed to and throwing it in there in a really haphazard fashion. So here he can't describe what the ark is like, but he can describe how long a chain is, which is nowhere in the Bible. So in 33, it continues, "Surely he did not believe in Allah the Great, nor did he urge the feeding of the poor. Therefore he has not here today a true friend, nor any food except refuse, which none but the wrongdoers eat." Again, hell is a very tactile excuse me, a very tactile place in Muhammad's imagination. But nay, I swear, but that which you see and that which you do not see, most surely it is the word wrought by an honored apostle, and it is not the word of a poet. Little is it that you believe. And the funny thing about this is because in the last surah we found he repeatedly denied being insane, despite all evidence to the contrary. And in this, he denies being a poet. And there was a great stream that Christian Prince did where he proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Muhammad actually did plagiarize Arabic poets that existed at his time, even though he had poets put to death, and specifically a female poet who was mocking him, he had her executed. But he also plagiarized poetry from contemporaneous poetry, Arab poetry, and I don't know what the name of the stream is, or if it's still online. But I would try to find that, because he actually proves that Muhammad, despite his denial, he did steal poetry from an Arab poet and tried to pass it off as a revelation from Allah. So he continues, nor the word of a soothsayer, little is it that you mind. And I already showed you how Muhammad already did things that were condemned in Deuteronomy, um, particularly in Deuteronomy 6. He did things that would have been worthy of a death sentence, uh, and that would have classified him as a false prophet, and he would have been subject to the same penalty as a soothsayer or a wizard or a witch. It is a revelation from the Lord of the worlds, and if he had fabricated against us some of the sayings, and this, pay attention to this is the key part, we would certainly have seized him by the right hand, and this I underlined for emphasis. Then we, he's referring to Allah here, even though he's using the plural pronoun, then we would certainly have cut off his aorta, and not one of you could have withheld us from him. And most surely it is a reminder for those who guard against evil, and most surely we know that some of you are rejectors, and most surely it is a great grief to the unbelievers, and most surely it is the true certainty. And this is a repetition again. 4 times he uses this to emphasize, and most surely it is the true certainty. And again, there's more redundancies. You find this a lot in the Quran. Therefore, glorify the name of your Lord, the Great. And that's the final verse. But the interesting part is in verse 46 when it says, then we would certainly have cut off his aorta. And this was after he was poisoned, and he died. He died several years later from the poisoning. The Jewish woman whose husband he had killed gave him a piece of poisoned meat, and he, subsequent to that, got deathly ill, and he died in agonizing pain 3 years later. And he said in those words, my aorta is severed, or I feel like my aorta is severed. And this is documented. This is attested to by Tafsir ibn Kathir and Sahih Bukhari. Both of them, they attest to the fact that his aorta was severed. So in other words, it says here, if he had fabricated against us some of the sayings, we would certainly have seized him by his right hand. Then we would certainly have cut his aorta. In other words, what he's saying here is that if I were a false prophet, then my aorta would have been severed. And this is exactly what happened to him after compiling this surah. He compiling these surahs, he died when his aorta was severed. So the only prophecy, or one of the only prophecies that came true, was the fact that Muhammad died the death of a false prophet. I just realized I had my headphones plugged in. My headphones plugged in during this entire video. But anyway, that's Surah 69, and Surah 70 is the ways of ascent. And we have about 36 pages left in the Quran, and 44 surahs. There are only about, I would say, maybe 20 or more surahs that I would devote like an entire video to. After that, they gradually decrease and are about 20 verses or less. So I'll probably do Surah 70 in my next video, which will probably be tomorrow. And I'll see you then. Thanks, everyone.